In the heart of northeastern Africa, nestled between the banks of the Nile and the Red Desert of Sudan, there thrived a civilization whose legacy was often overshadowed by its more famous northern neighbor, ancient Egypt. Yet, long before the grandeur of the pyramids or the rise of the pharaohs, a powerful kingdom flourished, one that would shape the course of African history for millennia. This kingdom was Nubia, a region that straddled the borderlands of modern-day Sudan and Egypt. While much of the world focused on the iconic civilization of Egypt, Nubia existed as a formidable force, both a rival and a crucial partner to its northern neighbor, with a rich cultural, political, and military history that stretched back far beyond what many realize. The earliest traces of Nubian civilization begin in the prehistoric era, far before written history began to take form in the ancient world. Nubians, like their counterparts in Egypt, were influenced by the natural resources and geography of their land. The Nile River, which cut through both Egypt and Nubia, was not merely a waterway. It was the lifeblood of these civilizations. It provided fertile soil for agriculture, a vital trade route, and a boundary between kingdoms. However, where Egypt often flourished with its vast plains and predictable floods, Nubia was defined by its rugged terrain, its mountains, and its rich deposits of gold. This contrast shaped Nubian society, endowing it with a distinct identity that would define its rise to power. In the beginning, Nubia was not a single, unified kingdom but rather a patchwork of small kingdoms and city-states, each with its own ruler, customs, and beliefs. The earliest of these were the Tasseti, located in the region of the first cataract of the Nile. The name itself, Tasseti, means land of the bow, reflecting the prowess of its people in archery and warfare, skills that would define Nubia's military culture for centuries to come. It was from these early settlements that the Nubians began to consolidate their power and expand their influence over the surrounding regions. The first major shift in Nubia's trajectory came with the rise of the Kingdom of Kush, located to the south of Egypt, a powerful kingdom that would grow to be a dominant force in northeastern Africa. The Kingdom of Kush became known for its rich deposits of gold, which would make it one of the wealthiest regions in the ancient world. But it wasn't just gold that would give Kush its power. It was also the kingdom's strategic position, right at the crossroads of African trade routes, and the military might of its people, who would often march north to confront Egypt. Unlike Egypt, which was focused on monumental architecture and the construction of vast empires, the Nubians had a different approach to governance. Their rulers, known as the Kandakes or queens, often held supreme power, with military leadership in their hands. This is a key distinction. While Egypt was dominated by its male rulers and pharaohs, Nubian society was often matriarchal, with women sometimes taking up arms and leading armies into battle. The role of the queen or Kandake was not merely ceremonial. She could lead her people in war, manage their riches, and dictate their diplomatic strategies. As the Kingdom of Kush grew in power, its influence over Egypt became undeniable. During the early centuries of the first millennium BCE, the Kushite rulers began to exert more control over Egypt, often through military might. The first significant military engagement between Nubia and Egypt was centered around the city of Thebes, a powerful Egyptian capital. It was during the 8th century BCE that the Nubian king Pi launched a military campaign to assert his dominance over Egypt. His army moved swiftly through the Nile Valley, and the Egyptian city-states, fractured and divided by internal conflicts, could not resist the might of Pi's forces. By the end of his campaign, Pi had not only defeated the Egyptian forces, but also claimed the title of pharaoh, marking the beginning of the 25th dynasty of Egypt. This dynasty, often referred to as the Kushite dynasty, saw the rulers of Kush assume the title of pharaohs and rule Egypt as their own. This was a defining moment in African history. For the first time, Nubian rulers stood at the pinnacle of power in Egypt, a civilization that had once looked down upon Nubia as a mere tributary. The Kushites, with their deep understanding of the land, the people, and the resources, now became the pharaohs, showing the world that Nubia's power was not only military, but also cultural and political. However, The relationship between Egypt and Nubia was not solely defined by military conquest. The Kushites were not conquerors in the same way the Assyrians or Persians were. They were keenly aware of the cultural and spiritual significance of Egypt. They adopted many of Egypt's customs, such as mummification and pyramid building, but infused them with their own traditions and artistic styles. The Kushite pharaohs, especially under King Taharqa, sought to reinvigorate the Egyptian empire by building temples, monuments, and tombs that reflected both Egyptian and Nubian influences. This blending of cultures would come to define the region and leave a lasting legacy on the architecture and art of both civilizations. Yet, despite the great successes of the Kushite dynasty, the challenge of maintaining power in Egypt was immense. In the 7th century BCE, the Assyrians, a powerful empire from the northeast, launched a military campaign to reclaim Egypt. With their superior weaponry and advanced military tactics, the Assyrians succeeded in driving the Kushites out of Egypt, and the last Kushite pharaoh, Tanemani, was forced to retreat back to Nubia. However, the retreat was not an end to the influence of Nubia over Egypt. Though they lost control of Egypt, the Kushites remained a powerful force in the region, and their legacy continued to resonate throughout the ancient world. The Kingdom of Kush, now re-established in its heartland, would continue to be a major power for centuries. It controlled the trade routes that connected sub-Saharan Africa with the Mediterranean, and its wealth from gold, ivory, and incense made it an essential player in the ancient world. The cultural and intellectual achievements of Nubia would also continue to influence civilizations far beyond its borders. Nubia's story, however, was not solely defined by its military prowess or the eventual loss of its Egyptian holdings. The kingdom's achievements in governance, art, religion, and science were equally remarkable. They produced some of the most advanced metallurgical technology in the ancient world, creating intricate iron tools and weapons that helped them maintain their military strength. Their art and architecture, often blending Egyptian and native Nubian styles, would influence cultures across Africa and the Mediterranean. As the Kingdom of Kush evolved, so too did its identity. The Kushites were not merely subjects of Egypt or conquerors of its lands. They were an ancient African civilization that stood on its own, with a unique identity and legacy that would endure through time. The history of Nubia, like the mighty river that defined its lands, would flow on, shaping the course of African history and challenging the conventional narratives of ancient civilization for centuries to come. In the centuries following the rise of the Kingdom of Kush, Nubia's position as a powerful force in northeastern Africa continued to evolve. After the Kushite pharaohs were driven out of Egypt by the Assyrians, the region would experience a phase of reflection and reconstruction. But this was not a time of retreat or stagnation. Instead, it marked a crucial moment in Nubia's history, as its rulers began to consolidate power once more within their heartland and reassert their influence over the Nile Valley. The decline of the Kushite dynasty in Egypt did not signal the end of Nubian prominence. Rather, it set the stage for a new chapter, one that would continue to shape the course of African history for centuries to come. In the aftermath of the Assyrian conquest of Egypt, Nubia's leadership faced the task of rebuilding and safeguarding their kingdom from external threats. The loss of Egypt meant the loss of territory, but it also meant that the Kingdom of Kush could refocus its efforts on strengthening its position in the southern Nile Valley. Unlike Egypt, which was often more politically fragmented, Nubia retained a sense of unity in its core regions, bound by a shared identity, language, and cultural practices. Yet the challenge was not simply to rebuild. It was also to redefine Nubia's relationship with Egypt, a land that had once been the object of their military ambitions and now stood as both a rival and an ancient influence. The new chapter for Kush began with a series of internal reforms aimed at revitalizing the kingdom's military, cultural, and economic foundations. King Pi's ancestors had laid the groundwork for a thriving society. But in the wake of their retreat from Egypt, new leaders would need to find ways to ensure that the kingdom did not collapse into obscurity. They would build upon the legacy of their predecessors, drawing strength from the lands around them. while keeping a keen eye on the north. To rebuild Kush's military prowess, the rulers of Nubia turned to their deep understanding of the terrain and the river that defined their empire. They were a people molded by their environment, with an intimate knowledge of the land that gave them an edge in warfare. The desert to the west and the mountains to the east formed natural barriers, but it was the Nile that was their most powerful ally. The river, which had always been a source of sustenance and communication, also became a strategic asset. The ability to move quickly along the waterway was a key advantage that allowed the Kushite forces to launch raids, respond to threats, and protect their borders. At the same time, the kingdom's economy began to recover from the shock of their retreat from Egypt. The rich natural resources of Nubia, especially its vast gold deposits, continued to be a cornerstone of the kingdom's wealth. Nubia's gold mines were among the richest in the ancient world, and despite the loss of Egypt, the demand for Nubian gold remained high. This wealth enabled the Kushites to rebuild their infrastructure and attract traders and artisans from across the Mediterranean, the Near East, and sub-Saharan Africa. It was through this flow of goods and ideas that Nubia was able to maintain a unique position in the ancient world, acting as a cultural and economic bridge between sub-Saharan Africa and the Mediterranean civilizations. Despite the loss of their direct influence over Egypt, the rulers of Kush were not content to simply fade into the background. Instead, they found ways to retain their relevance on the global stage. Their interactions with Egypt were complex. On one hand, they recognized that Egypt, with its rich cultural and religious traditions, remained a vital influence on Nubian society. On the other hand, the relationship was far from purely amicable. The Assyrian conquest had weakened Egypt, and its rulers were now struggling to regain their former glory. The Kushites, once pharaohs of Egypt, could not ignore the power vacuum left by Egypt's decline. The prospect of reclaiming their former dominance remained ever present. The first major sign that Nubia was preparing to reassert itself came during the reign of King Taharqa. Like his predecessors, Taharqa sought to restore Kush's position of strength and prominence in the region. But unlike his ancestors, who had been forced out of Egypt by foreign invaders, Taharqa faced a different set of challenges. The political landscape of Egypt had changed dramatically, and the Assyrians were not the only threat on the horizon. The growing power of neighboring states, such as the Libyan dynasties in Egypt, presented a new challenge for the Kushite rulers. Moreover, the Assyrian Empire, having conquered Egypt and placed its own puppet rulers on the throne, was a constant threat. Taharqa's reign marked the return of Nubian military intervention in Egypt. Determined to regain control of the Nile Valley, he launched a series of military campaigns to assert Kushite authority over Egypt. His forces clashed with the Assyrian Empire and fought back against the growing power of local Egyptian rulers. In a series of dramatic battles, Taharqa sought to reclaim the lands once ruled by his ancestors, often at great cost. His military campaigns were not only about securing the Nile Valley, but also about asserting the legitimacy of the Kushite monarchy in the face of both internal and external challenges. Taharqa's ambition was not simply to expand Kush's borders, but to re-establish his kingdom as a dominant force in the region, one that could rival any of the great empires of the ancient world. Despite his many successes, Taharqa's efforts to maintain control over Egypt ultimately proved unsustainable. The Assyrians, with their superior military technology and organization, eventually succeeded in driving the Kushites out of Egypt once again. While Taharqa was forced to retreat back to his heartland in Nubia, his reign nonetheless left a lasting legacy. Under his leadership, Kush became a symbol of resistance against foreign domination, and his military campaigns inspired future generations of Nubian rulers to continue fighting for their land and their culture. The withdrawal from Egypt, while a setback, did not mark the end of Nubian power. In fact, it opened a new chapter for the Kingdom of Kush, one that would see the kingdom focus more inwardly on consolidating its own strength and preserving its cultural heritage. The retreat from Egypt allowed the Kushites to build a more stable society, focusing on strengthening their military, economic, and political systems in preparation for future challenges. During this period, Kush saw a renewed focus on the arts and culture. Temples and monuments were constructed, reinforcing the kingdom's connection to its past and its religious identity. The Kushites, like the Egyptians before them, saw their rulers as divine beings, chosen by the gods to lead their people. The royal tombs of Kush, with their distinctive pyramids and intricate artwork, became symbols of Nubian power and sophistication. These monuments, many of which were located in the royal burial sites of Meroe, would serve as enduring reminders of the kingdom's strength and resilience. In this new phase of Nubian history, the Kingdom of Kush began to build on its foundations, securing its place as one of the great civilizations of ancient Africa. Though it no longer held sway over Egypt, the kingdom's legacy continued to influence the region for centuries to come. As the Kingdom of Kush looked forward, it understood that its strength lay not only in its military might, but also in its ability to adapt to changing circumstances. The Kushite kings, despite facing numerous challenges and setbacks, were determined to preserve their identity and power in a world that was rapidly changing around them. Through a combination of military strength, strategic diplomacy, and cultural development, the Kingdom of Kush would endure. It would continue to shape the history of Africa, leaving behind a rich cultural and historical legacy that would be felt for generations. In the end, the Kingdom of Kush proved to be far more than just a military power. It was a civilization that had mastered the art of survival and adaptation, and its influence would echo through the centuries. The Kingdom of Kush, after its retreat from Egypt and the end of the Kushite dynasty's rule over the Nile Valley, entered a phase of reinvention and adaptation. While the kingdom was geographically distant from the heart of Egypt's shifting power structures, its proximity to the ancient civilization meant that Nubia remained deeply connected to the cultural, political, and economic tides of the broader region. However, by the 7th century BCE, Kush had firmly established itself as a powerful and self-sufficient kingdom in its own right, an African empire that continued to define its own course despite the rise of new challenges and threats. As the Assyrian Empire's dominance over Egypt stabilized, the Kushites, though no longer rulers of the Nile Valley, remained a formidable power in northeastern Africa. Their position in the heart of Nubia allowed them to consolidate power, and their strategic location along critical trade routes gave them access to wealth and resources. Gold, ivory, and incense remained integral to their economy, and the Kushites were keenly aware of the commercial value of these resources in the Mediterranean and Near Eastern markets. The wealth from these goods was further augmented by the kingdom's agricultural productivity, bolstered by the fertile lands around the Nile. These elements helped Kush maintain a sense of stability even as it faced external threats. The retreat from Egypt, while initially seen as a humiliation, also presented the Kingdom of Kush with an opportunity to refocus inward. The kings of Kush, particularly during the reign of the 25th dynasty, have been deeply involved in Egypt's religious and cultural traditions. They have been pharaohs and conquerors, wielding significant influence over the course of Egyptian history. However, the withdrawal allowed the Kushites to turn their gaze southward, toward their own rich traditions and the consolidation of their regional power. Instead of remaining fixated on reclaiming Egypt, the Kushite rulers began focusing on furthering their own cultural identity, emphasizing their unique contributions to the broader African world. Despite the loss of Egypt, the Kingdom of Kush continued to exert influence over the region. The kingdom had always maintained a complex relationship with Egypt, characterized by both conflict and cooperation. But now, with Egypt under the dominance of Assyrian rulers, Kush's position became even more complicated. The Assyrians, with their aggressive expansionist policies, presented a looming threat to Nubia. Yet, despite this external pressure, the Kingdom of Kush managed to retain its independence. It was a kingdom that had learned to survive against the odds, and now, more than ever, it had to confront the shifting dynamics of the ancient world. This period of reinvention also saw a resurgence of Kushite military strength. Even though they had been forced to abandon Egypt, the Kushites maintained a fierce reputation as skilled warriors. The horse-mounted archers and charioteers of Kush had long been known for their precision and speed, and these forces were quickly re-established and further developed as the kingdom rebuilt its military. Warfare for the Kushites had always been as much a matter of strategy and terrain as it was of sheer strength, and the terrain of Nubia, its deserts, mountains, and rivers, had always favored their armies. With the wealth from their mines and their agricultural surplus, the Kushites were able to sustain a strong standing army that could respond to any potential incursions. The military capabilities of Kush were not confined solely to its own borders. Nubia, despite its own troubles, was positioned in a strategic location where it could exert influence on both the Nile Valley and the neighboring regions to the south. The southern reaches of the Nile, stretching into what is now Sudan, were rich in resources and minerals, and the Kushites were acutely aware of the importance of these territories. Over time, they expanded their influence over the southern regions, establishing trading networks and military outposts along the Nile's course. These regions, though far from the power centers of Egypt and Mesopotamia, provided Kush with a sense of security and economic stability that helped fuel its ongoing resurgence. However, despite their military strength, the Kingdom of Kush faced a new challenge with the rise of other regional powers. While Egypt was under Assyrian control, other kingdoms and peoples were rising in the ancient Near East and the Mediterranean. The growing power of the Persians and the expansion of trade routes across the Arabian Peninsula presented new challenges to the Kushites, whose sphere of influence was now more contested than ever before. Even as they maintained their political and military strength in Africa, the Kushites recognized the need to navigate this changing geopolitical landscape carefully. The cultural revival of the Kingdom of Kush during this time was equally important as its military resurgence. The loss of Egypt had not led to the abandonment of Egyptian traditions, but rather to a blending of the two cultures. The Kushites had long admired Egyptian art, architecture, and religious practices, but now they began to adapt these traditions into something uniquely their own. As they rebuilt their cities, they began to construct monumental structures that reflected both their African heritage and their Egyptian influences. The pyramids of Meroe, built during this period, are perhaps the most notable example of this synthesis. While the Kushite pyramids borrowed from the Egyptian tradition, they were also distinctly Nubian in their design, with sharper angles and smaller dimensions, indicating a clear departure from Egyptian architectural norms. This period of cultural resurgence was not just about building monuments. However, it was also about preserving and reviving the traditions of Nubia. The development of a distinct written language, artistic styles, and religious practices ensured that Kush would retain its unique identity, even in the face of external pressures. The Kushite kings made it a priority to restore the temples and shrines dedicated to the gods of their ancestors. These religious buildings were seen not only as places of worship, but also as symbols of Nubian resilience. By re-establishing their religious institutions, the Kushites reaffirmed their connection to the divine and reinforced their cultural values. Another key aspect of the Kingdom of Kush's cultural revival was its emphasis on the importance of its royal family and its rulers. While the ancient Egyptians had traditionally placed great emphasis on the divine right of their pharaohs, the kings of Kush similarly viewed themselves as divinely appointed rulers. However, unlike the Egyptian pharaohs, the Kushite kings were more directly involved in the affairs of their kingdom, particularly in the military and administrative spheres. They were not only seen as intermediaries between the gods and the people, but also as strong leaders who had the power to shape the course of their kingdom's future. It was during this period that the Kingdom of Kush began to develop a distinctive artistic tradition, one that reflected its unique cultural heritage. Kushite art, particularly in sculpture and pottery, featured bold, geometric designs and highly stylized representations of both humans and animals. This artistic tradition would go on to influence the broader African continent, with many later African societies borrowing from the iconography and symbols developed by the Kushites. Despite the challenges posed by the rise of new powers and the shifting dynamics of the ancient world, the Kingdom of Kush continued to thrive. By the end of the 7th century BCE, it had established itself as a major cultural and military force in Africa. The Kushite rulers, though no longer sitting on the thrones of Egypt, had adapted to the changing times. They had rebuilt their kingdom, revived their cultural traditions, and reasserted their influence over the regions surrounding the Nile. The Kingdom of Kush, though no longer the dominant power in the Nile Valley, had survived and evolved, establishing itself as a vital player in the larger geopolitical landscape of the ancient world. As the Kingdom of Kush continued to navigate the complex political landscape of northeastern Africa, it faced a variety of challenges that tested its strength and resilience. The legacy of the Assyrian invasion, which had forced the Kushites to retreat from Egypt, still loomed large in the kingdom's psyche. However, by the 6th century BCE, the Kushites were no longer focused solely on their past losses. Instead, they turned their gaze toward the future, seeking to rebuild and secure their position as a dominant force in the region. The era that followed would be marked by the kingdom's ability to adapt to new circumstances, forge powerful alliances, and continue to influence the culture surrounding it. In the aftermath of the Assyrian retreat, the Kingdom of Kush had endured significant upheaval. The shifting balance of power in Egypt and the surrounding regions required the Kushite kings to become increasingly diplomatic, navigating alliances and conflicts with neighboring peoples. While they were still viewed as a powerful force by many in the region, their influence was no longer defined solely by military conquests or territorial expansion. Instead, the rulers of Kush began to recognize the importance of strategic alliances and the consolidation of regional power. This new phase of Kushite history saw the kingdom shift its focus from external expansion to internal consolidation. The kings of Kush, now firmly ensconced in the southern portion of the Nile Valley, sought to strengthen the foundations of their kingdom by building a more robust infrastructure, developing trade routes, and fostering economic growth. They knew that their wealth, derived from the gold mines, ivory, and other valuable resources of their territory, was a crucial asset, one that could ensure the kingdom's prosperity even as it faced external threats. Kush had long been an integral part of regional trade networks, acting as a bridge between sub-Saharan Africa and the Mediterranean world. As Egypt's power waned, the Kushites became more involved in the trade routes that extended through the Horn of Africa, across the Red Sea, and into the Arabian Peninsula. These trade networks brought with them not only goods such as incense, textiles, and precious metals, but also ideas and cultural influences that would leave a lasting mark on Kushite society. Through these connections, the Kingdom of Kush gained access to the growing global economy and secured its place as a key player in the larger political and economic system of the ancient world. The trade routes also brought challenges. As Kush's influence in the region grew, it inevitably came into contact with other rising powers. The Persians, having expanded their empire westward from modern-day Iran, began to establish a foothold in the Mediterranean and the Near East, while the Greeks and later the Romans began their gradual ascent as imperial powers. The Kushites, though formidable, were not immune to these shifts in power. Nevertheless, they managed to maintain their autonomy, skillfully balancing diplomacy with military preparedness. As Kush grew in wealth and power, it also saw the rise of its unique cultural identity. The kingdom's rulers, still inspired by the grandeur of Egypt, worked to further define what it meant to be a Kushite. They emphasized the importance of their indigenous customs and traditions, many of which had been passed down for centuries. The art, architecture, and religious practices of the Kushites began to diverge more clearly from those of Egypt, marking a distinct break in the historical record. The development of monumental architecture became one of the defining characteristics of the Kingdom of Kush during this period. The most notable examples of this new architectural style are the pyramids of Meroe, which would come to symbolize the Kingdom of Kush at its height. Unlike the grand, sweeping pyramids of Egypt, the Kushite pyramids were smaller in scale, but no less impressive. They were constructed with sharp, angular faces and placed at steep inclines, creating a distinctive silhouette on the desert landscape. The Meroe pyramids were designed as royal tombs, a continuation of the ancient Kushite tradition of honoring their rulers in death as much as in life. These structures also marked a shift away from the monumental stone temples of Egypt, focusing instead on a more intricate, ornamental style that was uniquely Kushite. The role of religion in the Kingdom of Kush also evolved during this period. While the Kushites continued to worship many of the same gods as the Egyptians, such as Ammonius and Osiris, they also integrated their own deities into the pantheon. The most important of these was the god Apidmak, a lion-headed warrior deity who symbolized both strength and protection. Apidmak became central to Kushite religious life, often depicted in the royal iconography of the period. The presence of Apidmak reflected the Kushites' unique identity, distinct from Egypt, and symbolized their fierce independence. Alongside the rise of religion and art, Kushite society also saw significant advancements in technology and agriculture. The kingdom's ability to harness the resources of the Nile was key to its prosperity, and innovations in irrigation and farming techniques allowed the Kushites to sustain a large population. These advancements in agriculture were particularly important in ensuring that the kingdom could continue to produce the resources needed to maintain its military and political power. In addition, the skill of Kushite artisans, who were renowned for their expertise in metallurgy, enabled the kingdom to produce high-quality weapons and tools. The working of iron, in particular, became a hallmark of Kushite craftsmanship. Iron weapons allowed the Kushites to maintain their military strength and defend their territory from both internal and external threats. The Kingdom of Kush, however, faced significant challenges from neighboring regions. The rise of new empires in the Mediterranean and Near East created a more complicated geopolitical landscape, and the Kushites were forced to adapt their strategies accordingly. The growth of the Persian Empire, in particular, posed a challenge to Kush, as the Persians sought to expand their influence throughout the ancient world. While the Kushites managed to avoid direct confrontation with the Persians, the increasing presence of foreign powers along the Mediterranean trade routes had a ripple effect on Kush's position in the world. To maintain their independence, the Kushites continued to rely on their diplomatic acumen, forging alliances with other regional powers to ensure their survival in an increasingly competitive world. One of the most significant challenges to the Kingdom of Kush came with the rise of the Roman Empire. As the Romans began to expand their territory into the Mediterranean and beyond, they encountered the Kushites on the periphery of their empire. Initially, the Kushites and Romans maintained a cordial relationship, with the Romans viewing the Kingdom of Kush as a valuable trading partner. However, as the Roman Empire grew in strength, it began to assert its dominance over the region, including the trade routes that had long been vital to the Kushites. This brought the two civilizations into direct contact, and the balance of power began to shift. During this period, the Kingdom of Kush saw a gradual decline in its influence, as the Romans expanded their empire across the Mediterranean and into North Africa. The military pressure exerted by Rome, combined with internal struggles within Kush, weakened the kingdom's ability to maintain its power. Despite this, the Kushites continued to resist Roman influence, and their ability to retain a degree of autonomy during this time was a testament to their resilience and political savvy. By the 3rd century CE, the Kingdom of Kush had entered a phase of decline. The once thriving kingdom, with its rich trade networks, strong military, and distinct cultural identity, had begun to fade under the weight of external pressures and internal fragmentation. However, even in decline, the Kingdom of Kush left a lasting legacy. Its art, architecture, and contributions to African culture remained influential long after the fall of its empire. The pyramids of Meroe, the intricate metalwork, and the fusion of African and Egyptian religious traditions continue to be symbols of the kingdom's grandeur. Although the Kingdom of Kush eventually faded from the historical record, its role as one of Africa's most powerful and influential kingdoms cannot be overstated. The Kushites had managed to survive for centuries in the face of immense challenges, and their ability to adapt to the changing political and economic landscape of the ancient world ensured that their legacy endured long after their empire had fallen. Through their military might, cultural achievements, and strategic diplomacy, the Kingdom of Kush remained a significant player in the history of northeastern Africa, leaving an indelible mark on the world stage. As the Kingdom of Kush faced the slow erosion of its power and influence during the rise of the Roman Empire and the shift in regional politics, it entered a period of internal turmoil and external pressure. By the time of the 4th century CE, the once formidable kingdom had begun to lose its hold on the vast lands it had once controlled, particularly the crucial trade routes that spanned across the Nile Valley. Yet, even as the kingdom's political landscape was becoming increasingly fractured, the legacy of Kush was far from over. The echoes of its mighty civilization continued to resonate across the African continent and beyond, shaping the course of history in ways that would not be fully understood until much later. The decline of the Kingdom of Kush was in many ways a complex process. It was not a sudden collapse, but rather a gradual weakening of the central authority and a loss of cohesion among the regions that made up the kingdom. The Kushites, who had once been a unifying force in northeastern Africa, were now faced with numerous challenges that threatened their ability to maintain control over their territories. These challenges came from both within and outside the kingdom. Internally, the decline of Kush was largely the result of political fragmentation. The once centralized power structure of the kingdom began to break down as local rulers gained more autonomy. These regional rulers, who had once been part of the broader Kushite political system, began to act more independently, often pursuing their own interests at the expense of the unity of the kingdom. This fragmentation made it increasingly difficult for the Kushite kings to maintain control over their lands, as the political unity that had once characterized the kingdom began to disintegrate. Externally, the Kingdom of Kush faced a growing threat from the expanding Roman Empire. By the 1st century CE, the Romans had established a significant presence in North Africa, and their imperial ambitions were beginning to reach into the Nile Valley. The Romans, known for their military prowess and their ability to integrate diverse cultures into their empire, viewed the Kingdom of Kush as an obstacle to their expansion. While the Romans did not directly conquer Kush, their increasing presence in the region, particularly in Egypt, created a situation in which the Kushites could no longer maintain their previous level of influence. The kingdom's once robust trade routes, which had been vital for its economy, were now increasingly dominated by Roman-controlled regions, leaving the Kushites with fewer resources and less strategic advantage. One of the most significant consequences of this external pressure was the Kushite retreat from Egypt. Though the Kushites had once ruled over Egypt during the 25th dynasty, the Romans' growing control over Egypt forced the kingdom to withdraw from the area entirely. The loss of Egypt, which had been an essential part of Kushite identity and power, was a major blow to the kingdom's prestige and influence. No longer able to claim control over the Nile Valley, the Kushites were forced to shift their focus further south to the heartland of their kingdom. While the decline of the Kingdom of Kush was marked by the loss of Egypt and the weakening of central power, it was also a time of transition for the kingdom's cultural identity. The Kushites, despite the mounting external and internal challenges, managed to preserve many of the cultural traditions that had defined them for centuries. Religion, art, and architecture continue to play a central role in Kushite society, even as the kingdom's political and military power began to fade. The Kushites, like their Egyptian counterparts, maintained a strong connection to their religious beliefs throughout this period of decline. The worship of gods such as Ammonius, Osiris, and Epidmak continued to be central to the spiritual life of the Kushites, and the royal family remained committed to maintaining the religious traditions that had been passed down through generations. Temples and religious sites, many of which had been built during the height of Kushite power, were still used for worship and ritual, even as the kingdom itself was slowly unraveling. The royal tombs, particularly those at Meroe, remained important symbols of Kushite authority and religious devotion, despite the kingdom's political challenges. Art and architecture also remained key aspects of Kushite cultural life. The distinctive style of Kushite sculpture, with its intricate depictions of kings, queens, and deities, continued to flourish during the decline of the kingdom. These works of art, many of which were created to honor the gods or commemorate royal achievements, serve as both a reflection of the kingdom's rich cultural heritage and a means of asserting its continued relevance in a changing world. Similarly, the construction of pyramids at Meroe, though smaller than the Grand Pyramids of Egypt, continued throughout this period. These structures, designed as royal tombs, were symbolic of the Kushite rulers' ongoing connection to the divine, even as their political power diminished. Despite these cultural achievements, the Kingdom of Kush was not immune to the pressures of the external world. As the Roman Empire expanded its influence, the Kushites increasingly found themselves marginalized in the larger political and economic system of the ancient world. The loss of Egypt and the weakening of their military power meant that the Kushites were no longer able to maintain their position as a major political force in northeastern Africa. The Romans, now fully entrenched in Egypt and the surrounding regions, began to assert their dominance over the trade routes and resources that had once been vital to the Kingdom of Kush. In addition to the external pressure from the Romans, the Kushites were also facing challenges from other African kingdoms. The rise of powerful states in the interior of Africa, particularly in what is now Ethiopia and Sudan, further weakened the Kushite kingdom's ability to maintain control over its territory. These kingdoms, often with more centralized political structures, began to encroach on Kushite lands, further fragmenting the once great kingdom. By the 5th century CE, the Kingdom of Kush had effectively ceased to exist as a unified political entity. Its once great capital of Meroe, which had served as the heart of the kingdom for centuries, was now in decline. The Kushite kings, unable to maintain control over their former territories, retreated further south, eventually losing their grip on the land they had once ruled. The kingdom's power and influence waned, and by the end of the 5th century, the Kingdom of Kush had faded into history. However, the legacy of the Kingdom of Kush did not vanish with its political decline. The cultural achievements of the Kushites, particularly in art, architecture, and religion, left a lasting imprint on the region. The pyramids of Meroe, the artistic traditions of Kushite sculpture, and the religious practices of the kingdom would continue to influence the cultures of sub-Saharan Africa for centuries to come. Even as the kingdom faded from political prominence, the cultural legacy of Kush remained a symbol of African resilience and achievement. Moreover, the decline of the Kingdom of Kush did not mark the end of its historical significance. The story of Kush, a kingdom that rose to power and influence in the heart of Africa, was remembered by later generations as a testament to the strength, determination, and cultural vitality of the African peoples. The rise and fall of Kush became part of the larger narrative of African history, a story of empires, kingdoms, and civilizations that shaped the course of the ancient world. The fall of the Kingdom of Kush, while marked by political decline and fragmentation, was also a story of cultural endurance. The Kushites, despite losing their political power, managed to preserve their identity through their art, religion, and architecture. These cultural markers ensured that the legacy of the Kingdom of Kush would live on, continuing to inspire future generations of Africans and people around the world. Even as the kingdom's political power faded, its cultural contributions remained an important part of the fabric of African history, leaving a mark that would not easily be forgotten. The decline of the Kingdom of Kush, though significant, was not an immediate end to its influence in northeastern Africa. As the kingdom's political power waned in the 5th century CE, the cultural and historical legacy of Kush persisted across the African continent. The people of Kush, despite their political fragmentation and the encroachment of foreign powers such as the Romans and neighboring African kingdoms, continued to exert a quiet but undeniable influence on the world around them. The collapse of the kingdom did not signal the erasure of its history, but rather a transition into a new phase, one that would see the legacy of the Kushite civilization absorbed into the broader tapestry of African culture and history. As the Kingdom of Kush dissolved into smaller kingdoms and decentralized regions, the story of its once great capital, Meroe, stands as a symbol of both the kingdom's grandeur and its decline. Located near the confluence of the Blue and White Nile in modern-day Sudan, Meroe had been the heart of the kingdom for centuries. It was here that the great Kushite kings and queens were buried in their pyramid tombs, and it was here that the rich cultural traditions of the Kushites were at their peak. Yet, even as the kingdom fragmented, Meroe remained an important cultural and religious center. The pyramids of Meroe, smaller and steeper than those of Egypt, continue to stand as enduring monuments to the power and spirituality of the Kushites. These pyramids, along with the temples and royal palaces that once graced the city, would continue to be important symbols of Kushite civilization long after its political authority had collapsed. In the centuries following the decline of Kush, the legacy of the kingdom's art, architecture, and religious practices remained integral to the cultural development of the region. The distinctive style of Kushite sculpture, which had once adorned royal tombs and temples, continued to influence the art of surrounding African cultures. The Kushite tradition of creating elaborate royal tombs and pyramids, though no longer practiced on the same scale, was absorbed into the architectural traditions of later African empires. The iconography of the Kushite kings and queens, their powerful depictions in stone and bronze, would remain an enduring legacy for the people of the Nile Valley and beyond. The religious practices of the Kingdom of Kush also endured long after its political power had disappeared. The Kushites had always been deeply religious, with a pantheon of gods that included Ammonius, Osiris, and their own unique deities like Piedmok, the lion-headed god of war. These religious beliefs were woven into the fabric of Kushite society, influencing everything from the construction of their monumental temples to the art that decorated their cities. Even as the political structures of the kingdom faded, the Kushites' reverence for their gods continued to influence the spiritual practices of their descendants. The worship of Ammonius, in particular, which had been central to Kushite religious life, persisted in the region for centuries. Even after the fall of the kingdom, the influence of Kushite religious traditions can be seen in the religious practices of later kingdoms, such as those of Aksum and Nubia, which would continue to shape the spiritual landscape of northeastern Africa. As the centuries passed, the political vacuum left by the decline of Kush was filled by a series of smaller kingdoms and powers that arose in the region. The rise of the Kingdom of Aksum, a powerful empire located to the southeast of Kush, was one of the most significant developments in the post-Kushite period. Aksum, with its strategic location along the Red Sea, became a dominant power in the Horn of Africa and one of the most important trading civilizations of the ancient world. The Kingdom of Aksum absorbed many of the cultural and religious practices of the Kushites, including their architectural styles and religious beliefs. The Aksumite rulers, like the Kushite kings before them, built monumental structures and pyramids that reflected the enduring influence of Kushite traditions. Though the Kingdom of Aksum was distinct in its own right, its foundations were built on the legacy of the Kushite civilization. The relationship between Aksum and the remnants of Kushite civilization was complex. While Aksum's rulers absorbed and built upon many aspects of Kushite culture, they also sought to distance themselves from the remnants of the older kingdom. As Christianity began to spread throughout the region, particularly after the 4th century CE, the Kingdom of Aksum embraced the new faith, creating a new religious identity that contrasted with the traditional polytheistic practices of the Kushites. However, the influence of Kushite architecture, art, and religious practices can still be seen in the early Christian period of Aksum. The distinctive style of Kushite pyramids, for example, influenced the design of early Christian churches in the region, blending older African traditions with the new religious ideals. While the Kingdom of Aksum became the dominant power in the region, the remnants of the Kushite people continued to live in the territories of the former kingdom. Over time, the people of Kush were absorbed into the broader cultures of the surrounding kingdoms, including Aksum and the various Nubian states that arose in the aftermath of the fall of Meroe. These new kingdoms, such as the Kingdom of Makuria and Nubia, continued to maintain many of the traditions of Kush, particularly in their religious practices and political structures. The Nubian kingdoms, much like the Kingdom of Kush before them, would continue to play an important role in the history of northeastern Africa, building on the foundations laid by the Kushites. One of the most significant ways in which the legacy of the Kingdom of Kush lived on was through its contribution to African identity and unity. The Kushites, like the Egyptians before them, were a people who defined themselves through their connection to the land and their spiritual beliefs. Their art, their architecture, and their religious practices all reflected a deep connection to the natural world and the divine forces that they believed governed it. Even as the Kingdom of Kush faded, this sense of identity continued to influence the broader African world. The people of Kush, through their legacy of military prowess, religious devotion, and cultural achievements, had established a model for African civilizations to follow. The Kingdom of Kush's legacy was not just a matter of architectural monuments or historical events, but of the deeper cultural and spiritual values that shaped the identity of the African peoples who came after them. The Kushites' emphasis on unity, resilience, and the divine connection between ruler and people left an indelible mark on the civilizations that followed. The kingdoms of Nubia, Aksum, and even those further to the south would draw on this legacy as they sought to define their own paths in the centuries to come. In the modern world, the legacy of the Kingdom of Kush is still remembered and celebrated, particularly in the context of African history and identity. The pyramids of Meroe, the sculptures, and the artifacts that remain from Kushite civilization are a testament to the ingenuity, artistry, and spirituality of the people who built them. The rediscovery of these monuments in the 19th and 20th centuries, alongside ongoing archaeological efforts, has helped to restore Kush's place in the broader historical narrative. Today, the Kingdom of Kush is recognized as one of the great civilizations of ancient Africa, whose influence can still be seen in the cultures of northeastern Africa and beyond. While the kingdom itself may have faded, its legacy endures in the hearts and minds of those who continue to explore its history, art, and spiritual heritage. By the 6th century CE, the Kingdom of Kush had experienced profound transformations, and the once glorious empire that had dominated the Nile Valley for centuries had faded into history. Despite the political decline, the legacy of the Kushite civilization would continue to resonate through subsequent African kingdoms and cultures. In this period, the concept of the Kushite legacy began to evolve, deeply influencing the kingdoms that emerged in its wake, particularly in the region of Nubia and the surrounding areas. While the political structure of Kush had dissolved, its cultural, religious, and architectural achievements remained integral to the broader narrative of African history. Following the fall of Meroe, the political center of the Kingdom of Kush, the region was fragmented. The once unified and powerful kingdom was now divided into smaller, often contested, territories. However, the core identity of the Kushite people, their art, religion, and their connection to the Nile, endured. These remnants would shape the political and cultural landscape for centuries to come. While the idea of the Kingdom of Kush as a central power in northeastern Africa had dissipated, the echoes of its influence remained strong within the newly emerging Nubian kingdoms, including those that arose in the wake of the fall of Meroe, the kingdoms of Nubia, Makuria, and Alodia. As these new Nubian kingdoms began to take form, they inherited a legacy that was both culturally rich and politically complicated. Kushite art, architecture, and religious practices were not lost in the wake of the kingdom's collapse, but rather adapted and reshaped by the new rulers of Nubia. These smaller kingdoms, though less centralized than the great empire of Kush, maintained the distinctive features of the Kushite civilization, particularly in their religious practices and monumental architecture. The most obvious continuation of the Kushite architectural style was the use of pyramids. Though smaller and less grandiose than the pyramids of Meroe, these structures, which continued to be built in Nubia, reflected a deep-seated cultural tradition rooted in Kushite practices. In the centuries following the fall of Meroe, Nubia would see the rise of a more religiously oriented political structure. The Kingdom of Nubia, which had emerged in the northern region of Nubia, would adopt Christianity as its state religion by the 6th century CE. Despite the arrival of Christianity, The deep-rooted cultural traditions of the Kushites remained influential in shaping the religious and political landscape of the new kingdoms. In Nubia, as in the later kingdoms of Makuria and Alodia, the legacy of Kushite religious practices remained embedded in the local culture, particularly in the veneration of local deities and the concept of divine kingship. The Nubian kings who followed the Kushite dynasty were still regarded as divine figures, central to the religious and social fabric of their societies. The role of the divine ruler was a concept that had been integral to the Kingdom of Kush, and it continued to play an important role in Nubian political structures. The divine kingship of Kush, which had been influenced by Egyptian traditions, was also reflected in the rule of the Nubian kings who followed. They were seen not only as political leaders, but as representatives of the gods on earth. The fusion of indigenous African beliefs with those of Egyptian and later Christian traditions helped maintain a continuity of religious power that was vital for the survival and stability of the Nubian states. Even as Christianity spread throughout Nubia, the idea of the king as a divine figure persisted, particularly in the ceremonial practices and state rituals of the new kingdoms. This religious syncretism, the blending of different religious systems, would be one of the defining features of Nubian civilization in the centuries following the decline of the Kingdom of Kush. Nubian kings adopted Christianity not as a wholesale rejection of their ancestral beliefs, but rather as a means to adapt to the changing political and religious landscape of the broader Mediterranean world. Christianity, which had become the dominant religion of the Roman Empire and its eastern successor states, was seen as an effective tool for maintaining political legitimacy. However, the integration of Christianity into Nubian culture was not a simple process of conversion. It was a process that involved the blending of old and new traditions, which allowed the Nubian kingdoms to retain their cultural identity while aligning with the broader religious currents of the time. In terms of political and military organization, the kingdoms of Nubia would also draw from the strategic foundations laid by the Kingdom of Kush. The Kushites had always relied on their mastery of the Nile River for both trade and military purposes, and this legacy was continued by the Nubian kingdoms. The river was not just a physical feature of the landscape. It was a lifeline, a route of communication, trade, and military movement. The kingdoms of Makuria and Alodia, which rose to prominence after the fall of Meroe, maintained a strong military presence along the Nile, protecting their borders and ensuring that their access to the river's resources remained secure. In particular, the Kingdom of Makuria, which emerged as one of the dominant Nubian powers, drew directly from the military and strategic practices of the Kushite kingdom. Makuria's military forces, renowned for their cavalry and archery, continued the Kushite tradition of relying on skilled horsemen and archers. These forces were essential in defending Nubia from external threats, particularly from the powerful Islamic caliphates that began to spread across North Africa in the 7th century CE. The strength of the Makurian military was one of the key factors that allowed it to survive in a turbulent period of history. The Kingdom of Makuria was able to maintain a precarious balance between internal stability and external threats, often using diplomacy, military prowess, and strategic alliances to secure its position. Despite the growing influence of Islam in North Africa, Nubia was able to retain its independence for several centuries, largely due to the military strength and strategic alliances forged by the Nubian kingdoms. The Makurian kings, in particular, were adept at navigating the complex relationships between the Christian Byzantine Empire, the Islamic caliphates, and the rising powers of the Sahelian kingdoms to the west. Through a combination of diplomacy and military strength, the Nubian kingdoms were able to maintain their independence, preserving their distinctive cultural identity for centuries after the fall of the Kingdom of Kush. This period of Nubian history, particularly during the time of the Makurian kingdom, stands as a testament to the enduring legacy of Kushite civilization. While the political power of the Kingdom of Kush had waned, its cultural and military traditions continued to shape the development of Nubia and its surrounding regions. The kings of Nubia, drawing from the traditions of their Kushite ancestors, were able to establish powerful and enduring kingdoms that would last for centuries, influencing the course of African history. In the realm of art and architecture, the influence of the Kushites also remained visible. The pyramids of Meroe, although abandoned as royal tombs, continued to stand as symbols of the enduring power of Kushite art and architecture. These pyramids, along with the artistic traditions that they represented, were incorporated into the cultural practices of the Nubian kingdoms. The stylized representations of rulers and gods, as well as the elaborate depictions of religious and royal ceremonies, continued to be a central feature of Nubian art. The Nubian tombs, constructed in the tradition of their Kushite predecessors, were among the most significant architectural achievements of the region, and they would inspire the architecture of later civilizations, both in Africa and beyond. In the wake of the Kingdom of Kush's decline, the historical trajectory of northeastern Africa became increasingly fragmented. The once great civilization that had shaped the region for centuries was now reduced to a series of smaller kingdoms and polities, each navigating their own path in a world that was rapidly changing. Yet, even as the political and military might of Kush receded into history, its legacy continued to exert a profound influence over the regions it had once dominated, particularly in terms of cultural traditions, religious practices, and military strategies. One of the most notable aspects of the Kingdom of Kush's legacy was its religious and spiritual practices. Despite the fall of Meroe and the subsequent loss of centralized political power, the Kushite belief system persisted in various forms throughout the Nubian kingdoms that arose in the aftermath of the Kushite Empire. This continuity can be seen in the religious traditions of the kingdoms of Nubia, Makuria, and Alodia, all of which maintained a strong connection to the gods worshipped by the Kushites. The Kushite pantheon, which included gods like Ammonius, Osiris, and the warrior deity Apidmak, remained an important part of the spiritual life of the Nubian people. The concept of divine kingship, which had been central to the Kushite rulers' claim to power, also survived in the Nubian kingdoms. The kings of Nubia, much like their Kushite ancestors, were seen as representatives of the gods on earth. This belief in the divine right of kings ensured that the rulers of Nubia retained a special status in the eyes of their subjects. Even as Christianity began to spread across the region in the 6th century CE, the idea of divine kingship persisted, albeit in a Christianized form. The merging of old Kushite religious practices with the new Christian faith resulted in a unique spiritual synthesis that characterized the religious life of the Nubian kingdoms. Christianity, which had been adopted by the Kingdom of Nubia in the 6th century, was not viewed as a wholesale rejection of Kushite beliefs, but rather as a means of adapting to the broader Mediterranean world while preserving essential elements of local identity and tradition. While the religious practices of the Kushites persisted, the cultural and artistic traditions of the kingdom also lived on in the new Nubian states. Kushite art, particularly its distinctive sculptural style, continued to influence the artistic practices of the Nubian kingdoms. The kings and queens of Nubia, much like their Kushite predecessors, were often depicted in stone and bronze, with an emphasis on power, divine connection, and the ability to protect their people. These depictions were not merely artistic expressions, but were deeply tied to the political and spiritual roles that the rulers played in their societies. The sculptural traditions of Kush, characterized by detailed and stylized representations of rulers and gods, continued to flourish in Nubia long after the fall of Meroe. The architectural legacy of Kush also endured in the Nubian kingdoms. Although the grand pyramids of Meroe were no longer constructed on the same scale, the idea of building monumental tombs and temples persisted in Nubia. The smaller pyramids built by the Nubian kings, particularly in the region of Nuri, followed the same basic design principles as those of Meroe, though with some stylistic differences. The steep, sharp angles of the Kushite pyramids were replaced by more moderate designs. But the practice of building tombs for royalty in pyramid form remained a testament to the enduring influence of the Kushite architectural tradition. Additionally, the religious structures built by the Nubians, such as the Christian churches that were constructed in the centuries following the spread of Christianity, often incorporated elements of Kushite design, blending African and Mediterranean architectural styles. While the religious and cultural legacies of the Kushites were important, the military traditions that had once made the Kingdom of Kush a formidable power were also passed down to the new Nubian kingdoms. The Kushites had long been known for their military prowess, particularly their cavalry and archers. These skills, honed over centuries of conflict with neighboring powers, were crucial in maintaining the security of the Nubian kingdoms in the centuries that followed the fall of Meroe. The Kingdom of Makuria, for example, was renowned for its military strength, particularly its cavalry, which was a direct continuation of the Kushite military tradition. The Nubians, like the Kushites before them, understood the strategic importance of the Nile River, both as a trade route and as a natural defense. The river provided both an obstacle for potential invaders and a lifeline for the Nubian people, allowing them to maintain control over the region and defend their territories from foreign powers. In the 7th century CE, the rise of Islam in the Arabian Peninsula posed a new challenge to the Nubian kingdoms. As the Islamic caliphates expanded across North Africa, they began to exert pressure on the kingdoms of Nubia, which had previously been able to maintain their independence. The Kingdom of Makuria, in particular, found itself in conflict with the Islamic forces that sought to expand their territory into Nubia. However, the Nubians were able to resist the Islamic invaders, largely due to their military capabilities and strategic use of the Nile River. The Makurian kings were able to negotiate a series of treaties with the Islamic forces, maintaining the kingdom's independence while adopting certain aspects of Islamic culture and governance. This period marked the beginning of a long period of religious and cultural exchange between Nubia and the Islamic world, one that would shape the region for centuries to come. Despite the challenges posed by the spread of Islam, the Nubian kingdoms were able to maintain their distinct cultural identity. The influence of the Kushite civilization remained strong, particularly in the areas of religion, art, and architecture. The syncretism that emerged from the blending of Christian and indigenous beliefs in the early Nubian kingdoms was further complicated by the arrival of Islam, creating a unique cultural tapestry that characterized the region. This mixture of Christian, Islamic, and traditional African beliefs created a religious landscape that was unlike any other in Africa. The churches of Nubia, for example, were built in the distinctive Nubian style, with features that reflected both African and Christian influences. The art produced during this period, particularly in the Christian period of Makuria, also reflected this blending of cultures, with religious themes rendered in the distinctive Nubian style. One of the most enduring legacies of the Kingdom of Kush was the region's continued importance as a center of trade and culture. The Nubian kingdoms, particularly Makuria, maintained key trade routes that connected sub-Saharan Africa with the Mediterranean and the Arabian Peninsula. The trade of gold, ivory, and other valuable commodities continued to be a significant part of the Nubian economy, and the Kingdom of Makuria remained a powerful player in the regional trade networks. The political and cultural connections between Nubia and other parts of the African continent, as well as the broader Mediterranean world, ensured that the legacy of Kush was far from forgotten. As the centuries progressed, the Kingdom of Makuria began to decline, largely due to internal political struggles and external pressure from the Islamic forces to the north. However, the cultural and religious legacy of the Kushite civilization continued to be felt in the Nubian kingdoms and beyond. The decline of the Nubian kingdoms did not erase the influence of Kush, but rather allowed it to be absorbed into the larger history of northeastern Africa. In modern times, the Kingdom of Kush is increasingly recognized as one of the great civilizations of ancient Africa. Its contributions to art, architecture, religion, and military strategy having shaped the course of African history. The legacy of Kush continues to inspire scholars, historians, and cultural leaders, as it provides a powerful reminder of the rich history of Africa's past. The ruins of Meroe, the pyramids of Nubia, and the religious and artistic traditions of the Nubian people stand as lasting symbols of the Kushite civilization's enduring impact on the region. Though the Kingdom of Kush itself may have faded into history, its cultural and historical legacy continues to resonate through the ages.